The unthinkable just happened on live television, not in a quiet committee room, not buried in some late-night report. Right there in front of the cameras, Nigel Farage laid out a chain of claims that could shake the very foundations of the British political establishment, and at the centre of it all was Keir Starmer.
This has been a pretty remarkable day. The Mandelson files, as they're being called by the media, don't think of this as just another bad day at the office for the Prime Minister. Don't think of this whole question as another political story that sickens you with career politics. No. You need to think about this in a much, much bigger context. The last major political scandal in Britain was Profumo, and that is over 60 years ago. What was that all about? Well, it was all about women, it was all about a Russian spy, and it was about cabinet ministers and senior Conservative Party people. This involves the royal family. This involves a former Prime Minister turning his guns on a current Prime Minister. This involves the leaking of cabinet state secrets to the highest level. It involves market-sensitive information of the most profound nature. It involves, in my view, one or two elements that are quite potentially breaches of the Official Secrets Act.
What started as just another day in Westminster suddenly turned into something far more serious. This wasn't a routine political disagreement. This wasn't the usual back and forth between government and opposition. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you care about what's really happening in British politics behind the headlines, beyond the spin, then please take just 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the Britain Daily. It's completely free and it helps us keep bringing you the hard-hitting stories that matter. According to the claims being discussed, this was something bigger, darker, and potentially far more damaging than anything British politics has seen in decades. Farage didn't frame it as a normal scandal. He framed it as a moment that could define an entire political era. He pointed straight to what's being called the Mandelson files and warned viewers not to treat it as just another bad headline. In his words, this wasn't about career politicians making mistakes or another messy Westminster story. This, he suggested, had the potential to be one of the most serious political controversies since the Profumo affair more than 60 years ago, and that comparison alone tells you how explosive this situation has become. The Profumo scandal in the 1960s brought down a government. It involved lies to Parliament, Cold War tensions, and questions about national security. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilising. So when Farage invokes that comparison, he's not just talking about headlines, he's talking about political consequences. According to the claims being discussed, this situation could involve senior figures at the highest levels of government, sensitive information, and decisions that may now come under intense scrutiny. Farage described it as a web of questions. Who knew what? Who stayed silent? Who should have spoken? And what the consequences could be. And then came the most dramatic part. He suggested that this story touches not just politicians, but potentially the royal family, former prime ministers, and the leaking of highly sensitive information. He even raised the possibility of breaches of the Official Secrets Act, one of the most serious legal matters imaginable in British public life. Those aren't casual claims. They are the kind of claims that, if proven, end careers overnight. Back in Parliament, the pressure was already building. During Prime Minister's questions, the opposition leader fired off a series of direct questions about the appointment of Peter Mandelson as ambassador to Washington. The key issue? Whether the Prime Minister knew about alleged past contacts that should have triggered alarm bells during the vetting process. At first, the questions were brushed aside, then they were deflected. But on the third attempt, the Prime Minister was forced to acknowledge the core point. And in politics, that moment matters. Because once a leader is forced to concede even a small part of a damaging narrative, the entire story starts to shift. What was once a rumour becomes a question. What was once a question becomes a headline. And what was once a headline can quickly become a full-blown crisis. But that was only the beginning. The real drama came when MPS demanded to see the documents behind the appointment, the briefings, the decisions, the reasoning. And suddenly, the list of reasons why those documents couldn't be released started to grow. National security, international relations, trade sensitivities, each category added another layer of secrecy. And with every new restriction, the suspicion inside the Commons only intensified. Even members on the government's own benches began to wonder what exactly was being hidden. Because in politics, secrecy always creates the same question: what are they trying to protect? And that question set the stage for what happened next, because the next exchange in Parliament would trigger a chain reaction that no one in Downing Street could control. What happened next was the explosion. Because the real danger for any Prime Minister isn't just attacks from the opposition. That's expected, that's routine, that's politics. The real danger begins when the pressure starts coming from inside your own ranks. When your own allies begin asking the same questions as your opponents. And that is exactly what unfolded in the Commons. After the initial exchange, the focus shifted to one critical demand. Who should decide what information MPS are allowed to see? The Prime Minister suggested that certain documents would have to remain hidden because they involved national security, trade matters, and international sensitivities. But that answer didn't calm the situation. It made it worse. Because MPS immediately saw the problem. If the government itself decides what information is too sensitive to release, then how can anyone trust the process? How can the same people involved in the decision also decide what evidence is allowed to be examined? In plain terms, it looked like marking your own homework. And that's when the fourth question landed, the one that changed everything. The opposition demanded that the Intelligence and Security Committee, an independent body of MPS and experts, be given the authority to decide what documents should be released. Not the Prime Minister, not the Cabinet Office, an independent committee. It was a direct challenge to the government's control of the narrative. If the Prime Minister agreed, it meant handing over power and admitting that the situation required outside scrutiny. If he refused, it would look like a cover-up. There was no comfortable option. Inside the chamber, the mood began to shift. This wasn't just partisan theatre anymore. According to multiple observers, even MPS on the government benches were starting to feel uneasy. The sense was growing that something wasn't right. And the more the government resisted, the worse it looked. Because in politics, perception often becomes reality. And the perception forming inside the Commons was dangerous. That information was being withheld, and that the government was trying to control what Parliament could see. The Prime Minister didn't immediately agree to the demand. The session ended without a clear concession, and by all accounts, he left the chamber under heavy pressure. But the drama didn't stop there, because only a short time later, something happened that changed the tone completely. A senior figure from within the government's own side stood up and backed the call for independent scrutiny. The argument was simple. Given the public concern and the seriousness of the allegations, transparency was essential. The Intelligence and Security Committee should be involved to restore confidence. That moment mattered more than anything the opposition had said all day. Because when criticism comes from across the aisle, it's politics. When it comes from your own side, it's a warning. And within just a couple of hours, the government shifted its position. The decision was made. The Intelligence and Security Committee would now have a role in deciding what material could be released to MPs. It was a clear retreat. In Westminster terms, it meant the government had blinked. And once the government is seen to back down under pressure, the political damage often spreads faster than the original scandal itself. Questions multiply, journalists dig deeper, rivals inside the party begin calculating their chances. The narrative changes from "is there a problem" to "how big is the problem?" That's when a controversy becomes a crisis. Because now the focus wasn't just on the allegations, it was on the fact that the government had resisted scrutiny and then reversed course when the pressure became too great. And as Nigel Farage and other commentators began pointing out, the implications of the story could be far-reaching, not just politically embarrassing, but potentially involving legal questions, national security concerns, and reputational damage at the highest levels. The comparison to the Profumo affair suddenly didn't seem so dramatic anymore because the Profumo scandal didn't bring down a government overnight. It started with questions. It grew into a loss of trust. And eventually it collapsed the authority of those at the top. And now some commentators were openly asking the same question. Is this the beginning of a similar unravelling? By the time the dust began to settle, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a messy political story. It wasn't just another awkward Prime Minister's questions, and it certainly wasn't just a bad headline that would disappear in a day or two. This had started to look like something bigger, something deeper, something that could reshape the entire political landscape, because scandals in politics don't bring leaders down overnight. They work like slow leaks in a dam. At first, it's just a crack. Then the pressure builds. Then the questions multiply. And before anyone can stop it, the whole structure gives way. That's why so many commentators immediately reached for the comparison to the Profumo affair. Back in the 1960s, it didn't look like a government-ending scandal at first. It was just one man, one relationship, one lie in Parliament. But the damage wasn't in the details. The damage was in the loss of trust. Once the public stopped believing what the government said, everything else started to crumble. And that's the risk now. Because the controversy surrounding this appointment, the alleged links, the withheld documents, and the questions about national security aren't just about one decision. They're about judgment, about transparency, about whether the public and Parliament are being told the full truth. And once those doubts take hold, they don't disappear easily. What made this moment particularly dangerous for the Prime Minister was the speed at which the narrative shifted. In just a few hours, the story went from opposition attacks to questions inside the Commons, to pressure from within his own political ranks, and finally to a government retreat. That kind of rapid escalation is rare, and in modern politics, perception travels faster than facts. Once the public starts to see a leader as weakened, that image becomes very difficult to reverse. Every mistake looks bigger. Every hesitation looks like panic. Every internal disagreement looks like the beginning of a power struggle. And that's exactly what some observers are already hinting at. Because when senior figures inside a party start positioning themselves as the voices of transparency and accountability, it can sometimes signal something else. Ambition, leadership, speculation, the quiet calculations that happen behind the scenes when a Prime Minister looks vulnerable. History shows that political careers often don't end with one dramatic moment. They end with a series of small humiliations, each one chipping away at authority until there's nothing left to defend. And this day in Parliament felt to many like one of those moments. Not because it proved everything, not because it answered all the questions, but because it showed something more dangerous, a loss of control. The government didn't set the pace of the story. It reacted to it. It resisted scrutiny. Then it reversed its position under pressure. That sequence alone is enough to shake confidence inside Westminster. Now, everything depends on what the Intelligence and Security Committee finds, how long the process takes, and what information eventually becomes public. Because if damaging details emerge, this story could grow far beyond a single appointment or a single decision. It could become a defining scandal of the era. And if that happens, the consequences won't just be personal, they'll be political. Party dynamics could shift. Leadership challenges could emerge. Election strategies could change. The entire balance of power inside British politics could start to move. All from one controversy that, at first glance, looked like just another day at the office. But as history has shown, those are often the days that matter most, because sometimes the moment a government loses control of the story is the moment it starts losing control of everything else. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening behind the scenes, like this video, share it and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Does this scandal change everything, or is it just another political storm that will pass?